Hi, this is Reggie Mara. It's May 14th, 2026, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time today reviewing 10 years of what I refer to as Healing America's Narratives. I mean, that's a book that came out in 2022, but had its genesis in 2016. And I'll say a little bit about that story and how it came about. So in 2016, some of you might remember Donald Trump was named as the presumptive Republican candidate for the presidency and actually did become president. And I grew up in Yonkers, New York, and did my undergraduate work out in Queens. So I was aware of him and who and how he was pretty much from the late 70s into the 80s when he began appearing on the nightly local news in New York City, um, and in the local tabloids, and occasionally even in the New York Times as the heir apparent to his father's millions and buildings and construction company, as a real estate developer. So it was striking to me that people thought he would make a good president, um, but that's neither here nor there. So I wrote a bit about how I believed that, and this is in 2016, that he embodied the worst of the United States, and more specifically, the worst of the unconscious aspects of the United States, or the shadow of the United States. And again, this was 2016. So shadow in the Jungian sense is that part of an individual or an organization or even a nation that the individual, organization, or nation is unaware of. That's not yet in consciousness. Um, and we all have shadow. Right? And the goal is, once we get into our late teens, early 20s, and for the rest of our adult lives, that we begin to work with it, find the things that we deny or that are unconscious, recognize them, own them, and integrate them into us, into ourselves, so we'll be more fully integrated, fully human beings. If we don't do that work, we always have the shadow. So I did some research, and I feel comfortable saying that the 9 elements that I can prove of the collective shadow of the United States. Again, I'm not describing the country as a whole. I'm describing the collective shadow of the United States, has at least 9 elements, and those are ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. And again, the point I'm making is that in one man, Donald Trump, uh, we have the embodiment of all 9. If you don't believe that those 9 traits are part of the American shadow, just watch him, listen to him, see what he does. That was true before 2016. I'm not going to go into great detail about his having been engaged in more than 3,500 lawsuits prior to becoming president, but he lived a life of antagonism, basically not paying his vendors, not paying construction companies, suing them and settling for 75 cents or 85 cents on the dollar, so that he paid less than he owed them and they pretty much got screwed. He had a history of doing that. Um, but more to the point, the United States of America, tens of millions of people of the United States of America, have seen fit to elect him twice to the presidency, and we're really paying the price for that now. Having said that, Healing America's Narratives, and the subtitle of the book is um, the feminine, the masculine, and our collective national shadow. Uh, the book isn't about him. It's about the shadow of the nation and what we might want to do to recognize it, own it, and integrate it so we can become a more fully functional country. So fast forward to today, 2026. Um, I've continued to write. I've been teaching this material for the last 5 semesters at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, at University of Connecticut, in Waterbury, Connecticut. So the work has continued to evolve. I'd like to share a little bit about that evolution with you today, since uh, if you're paying attention, you realize that the Democratic undergirdings of this nation are gradually being dismantled. And it's not going to suddenly get better overnight or even suddenly in 2026 with midterms elections or in 2028 should a Democratic person be elected to the presidency. A lot of the damage that has been done will take decades, if not generations, to build back, to use a Joe Biden phrase, better. A lot of damage is being done. So more to the point, for functional democracy, I would argue that the most essential element for a real democracy or democratic republic, as we have here in the United States, we need to honor the dignity of every human being. If you'd like to qualify that and say every American citizen, that's fine, but it's every human being, because whether somebody is not a citizen, but they're a documented immigrant, or they're not a citizen and they're an undocumented immigrant, they are still human beings and they still deserve to be treated with dignity because they have inherent dignity as human beings. And they should be held accountable to the rule of law, as should the President of the United States. We all should. The basic flaw in the United States of America, which is informed by those 9 elements of shadow, and which has been present in the country since the country's birth, pick 1776 if you want, or 1787 with the Constitution, is that money, things, and beliefs are more important than humans and other living beings, sentient beings. I'll say that again. The underlying flaw of the United States of America is that money, things, and beliefs are more important than humans and other living beings. Now, most American individuals, most American citizens, or people who want to come here and become American citizens would say, well, I don't believe that. And I would agree with that. Most of us don't believe that. That fundamental flaw is inherent in the power structure, the power infrastructure of the nation. All right, all you have to do is turn on a television set, scroll on your phone or your computer, look at the advertising, look at who is in charge of the country and what they are doing. And there are billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars spent for things that have nothing to do with the dignity of human beings and have everything to do with money and more material things and hardware based on certain beliefs, many of which are false or errant at best. So again, the shadow elements, I'm going to just say them again now so we can keep them in mind, are ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. I think I got all 9 of them. You can catch me if I didn't. The work we have to do includes understanding history. It includes understanding developmental psychology and shadow, which is a psychological concept. It includes understanding how politics works. It includes understanding the Constitution of the United States, the rule of law, and it includes spirituality as well. Who we are as human beings, and some important aspects of that sense of identity, which for me is a spiritual exploration. So early on, each one of us is given a view of the world by our parents, by the other adults in our lives, by our earliest teachers, by our religion, if we have one, by our recognition of our citizenship, once we're old enough to understand that. And I call those cultural givens. I didn't invent that, but that's a useful name. The culture gives us certain beliefs, some of which are given by adults who believe that these beliefs are true, some of which are given by adults who are trying to find simple ways of explaining the world to young children. So, you have Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and other myths like that. If you're in your mid-20s and older, if you're 25, 35, 45, 75, 85, and you haven't explored and interrogated what you were given as a child, you probably have a real large shadow. Robert Bly referred to the shadow as an invisible bag that as children, we put all the things that our parents and teachers don't like about us into the bag. And if we're conscious, we spend, by the time we turn 20 or so, we spend the next 40 or 50 years taking those things out so we can become more fully integrated human beings. So if you've never interrogated what you were given as a child, if you still believe everything that you were given as a child, you have a lot of stuff in your invisible bag, and you need to take a look at it. So it's an ethical obligation to be a functioning adult in the 21st century, to look at what you were given, interrogate it, keep those things that hold up. I'm not saying it's all wrong. Revise those things that need to be changed and get rid of the ones that are, provably false. So those are cultural givens. Let's say a little bit about development. For the last almost 60 years now, researchers have done longitudinal studies that have proven that we can continue to develop throughout our adulthood. And by development, I'm referring to our view of the world. Right? Our sense of cognition, what we're aware of, our sense of values, our sense of moral reasoning, our sense of emotional competence. All of these things can continue to develop throughout our lives. The problem we face is that from birth through somewhere between 18 to 22 years old, it's kind of a flexible range there. As long as we're relatively well-loved and relatively well-fed and nurtured, development happens through infancy, toddlerhood, early, middle, and late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and adulthood, more or less automatically through our early 20s. Beyond that, we need to do some work if we want to continue to develop. And actually, development can take place. This is not clinical, what I'm going to share now, but I believe, I have evidence for this, but it's anecdotal, so it's not science. There are three ways we can develop. There's lots of examples of people developing through recovery from trauma. Something horrible happens. They work on their recovery and they see the world differently, a wider, deeper view of the world. That's development. Okay. Another way, good things just happen. Suddenly somebody wakes up one day or has an experience, they're down by the shore or they're looking at a mountain or they see a beautiful sunrise or sunset and their life changes because of something they see in nature, or just serendipitous or grace happens and they just develop that way. Okay. That can happen. And then the third way is intentional practice. You commit to your own development. Personally, I like intentional practice because I'd prefer avoiding trauma if I can, and I'm not crazy about waiting around for grace or serendipity. So development is a real thing. There are quite a few real models of it that are out there. If you want to do some research on your own and look at them, look at people like Robert Keegan, Terry O'Fallon, Suzanne Cook-Greiter, the work Carol Gilligan has done with boys and girls, research on how boys and girls develop and how they develop differently and what the culture demands of them differently that kind of puts them into cultural stereotypes. And then Ken Wilber's work integrates a lot of these different models. There are many of them out there. But here's a shorthand that I use in the book and I use in my teaching, and every psychologist I know has said that it holds up. So very simple, and you'll recognize it as soon as I say it. Early on, especially in toddlerhood, we are me-centric creatures. It's all about us. And toddlers learn how to say no, they learn how to say me, and that's why they call them the terrible twos, because it's all about them. And that's a perfectly natural, normal, and necessary developmental level if you're a toddler. If you're still in a me-centric worldview, when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there are some problems with that, right? Graduating from me-centrism is a graduation into us or group-centrism. You've heard the phrase ethnocentric. That's an example of a group-centric or us-centric developmental worldview. So rather than thinking it's all about me, I'm primarily identified with it being all about my group or my groups. Common groups are religion, citizenship, ethnicity, race, even though that's culturally constructed. It's not a real thing, but it's real in its impact on us. So there are many, many types of groups that you can be identified with. And me-centrism and us-centrism in all of the developmental levels can be healthy or unhealthy. Again, a toddler who's me-centric, that's healthy. That's what they need to grow through that. We need to grow through that when we're toddlers. Us-centrism, nothing wrong with it, nothing wrong with feeling comfortable in your family of origin or your religion or your citizenship or your ethnicity. But it becomes a problem when it devolves into an us versus them perspective. And when it's us versus them, if you look historically, not just in the United States, but across all history, an us versus them worldview is responsible for every human atrocity at scale that's ever been committed. And I'll say that again. An us versus them worldview is the view of the world that's responsible for every human atrocity at scale, historically, throughout human history. Sure, occasionally there's a me-centric person who initiates it, but whether it was Genghis Khan, whether it was Adolf Hitler, whether it was Joseph Stalin, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it's Donald Trump, no individual can do damage at scale without the help of followers. So it's an us versus them perspective. Graduation from us versus them, and most people on the planet live in an us-centric or me-centric perspective. The next one is an all of us or a human-centric perspective, where I really identify with all humanity, where even though I still see tall, short, thin, stout, Italian, Irish, African, German, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I see all the different differences in the appearances and the diverse ethnicities of humanity. I recognize that we're all part of the same species. So I care deeply about every human being. I'm not actively able to care about each of the 8 billion people on the planet, or even the 340 million people in America, or even the X number of million people in my state in which I live. But that's my identity. And I care when any human being suffers. I can't stop it. I can't go to them every time they suffer, but it's a way of being in the world. Many people, many of you who are listening to me say this, understand that perspective, maybe even aspire to it, and maybe even espouse it, but very few people really live that day to day. You might, I'm not saying you don't, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage of the population. And if you graduate from there, postgraduate school is an all that is centrism, or a universe centrism, where you recognize and you live as though you're part of everything. Call it creation, call it the universe. You're part of the planet. Right? It goes beyond the planet, but you have this planetary identity, a universal identity. So you care about all that is. And if you think of any historical or current spiritual leaders who aren't preaching against another group, we lost Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk, several years ago. The Dalai Lama is still alive. That's where these people live, where they're really in touch with an identity. They see themselves as part of the whole shebang. All right, so me-centrism, us-centrism, all of us, or human-centrism, and all that is centrism. Those are the 4 developmental levels that I use as shorthand. They're important because when we look at American history, we'll see that it's been dominated by an unhealthy us-centrism. And we'll say more about that. All right. So in order to continue with this idea of dignity, where dignity is important, human dignity is important to be part of a democracy, so is love. And if you're, no matter what religion you belong to, you've heard about love. And no matter what religion you don't belong to, you don't have any religion, you've heard about love. And we speak about that word and use it, and we say, I love you, or do you really love me, or whatever you might say to somebody. And there are three useful definitions of love or ways of approaching love that I find useful. I'm going to share them briefly. I'm not saying these are correct. I'm not saying that you should agree with me. I'm saying I find these useful. If you imagine the three of them in a Venn diagram where they intersect is a powerful place. So the first one comes from a Benedictine monk, David Steindl-Rast, who said that love is the joyful acceptance of belonging. So love is joyful. It accepts belonging, and just take that as it is. Belonging to what? He doesn't say belonging to some specific thing. Joyful acceptance of belonging. So I belong to myself. I love myself. I belong to my groups. I belong to humanity. I belong to the universe. And I joyfully accept belonging there. That's a kind of powerful love, or a powerful kind of love. A second example is from Scott Peck in his first book, The Road Less Traveled, where he described or defined love as the will to extend oneself for one's own or another's spiritual growth. So he adds this idea of will now. So loving involves a commitment or a choice or a decision as well. And if it's love, you go out of your way, you extend yourself. I extend myself for my own growth or development or that of somebody else. So that's a kind of love. And then the last one is a paraphrase from Marianne Williamson speaking about A Course in Miracles. And this, I don't think this actually exists in A Course in Miracles as a statement, but it's throughout the book, it's kind of implied, is that love is the absence of fear. So if you can imagine a moment in your life where you don't have, and I'm going to extend that, you have no sense of fear or worry or anxiety. And you can find a moment when you feel that. What remains is love. No worry, no fear, no anxiety. So the absence of fear, the will to extend oneself, the joyful acceptance of belonging, love is at the intersection of that. You might have your own version of it, that's great, but love is important. Truth is another important element in a democracy. And I believe there are three stages of truth. There's really only one, but we get to it in three ways. So one is truth is a good faith expression of my best sense of what's true. So if I'm not trying to manipulate somebody and I express something as true, that's truth, right? It's not the final truth or the best version of it. But again, if I'm not being manipulative, I'm being authentic, and I'm acting in good faith and I express something as true, that's true. Or at best, it's truthful, perhaps. The next version is that which is most commonly accepted in a modern society, where truth is that which is evidence-based, it's fact-based, and it can be agreed upon by an ideal observer or disinterested third-party observers. And from we want to get into the science of it, it's based on evidence, which is observable, measurable, and repeatable. In other words, anyone in any culture, from any religion, from any background, could perform the experiment, observe what's going on, measure it, and repeat it, and get the same result. That's truth. And then we're going to put a caveat next to that, because truth evolves as new evidence that was previously unavailable becomes available. So Parker Palmer, a preeminent American educator, defined truth in his book, The Courage to Teach, as being an eternal conversation about things that matter, conducted with passion and discipline. So truth is ongoing, it's eternal. It's a conversation. Right? It involves more than one person. Right? It concerns itself with important things. It's about things that matter. And it invites and allows both passion, emotion, and discipline. And that's the science part. That's the evidence-based part. So we need to, look at truthfulness, what I say in good faith, evidence-based truth. Let's just use science. We could say journalism. Anybody that has a review system that, that insists on vetting what we say is true or not. And then the realization that things change. There was a time in human history when, even though the orb we know as Earth was in fact not flat and was a sphere, it was truthful to say the Earth is flat because no human being knew otherwise. Before the tools of modern science, telescope, and nowadays with satellites and with space travel, we can actually see it. But there was a time when the Earth was flat, as far as humans could tell. That was the truth at a certain time. Right? There was a time when the truth was that cigarettes were good for your health. Right? Even though objectively we now know that's not true, we didn't know that at the time. Right? So that's truth. Freedom. Two simple ideas about freedom. There's the freedom from things, and there's the freedom to do things. So freedom from is kind of like the foundational aspect of freedom, removing the barriers to freedom. And then freedom to is the freedom that allows us to actually, take an example, to live a healthy, passionate, purposeful, meaningful life that does no harm to anybody else. So freedom's important. And as we work through love and truth and freedom, we need to apply skillful means. It's very important to be skillful. And what I mean by that is, if you go for surgery, you want the surgeon to make the incision at the right depth, the right length, the right part in your body, and most importantly, perhaps on the right patient. If you're a teacher or a parent, you want to deal with your students or your children in a chronologically and developmentally appropriate way. That's skillful means. If you're a mechanic, you want to tighten the bolt or tighten the nut in a way that you do not strip the threads, but that you tighten it so that it's functional, so that whatever you're tightening doesn't get loose as you use it. All right, the lugs on the wheel don't come off, and the tire doesn't go flying off the car. So you get the idea, right? So this is some basic concepts that we need in democracy. Now, we're speaking about all of this in the context, again, of Healing America's Narratives. Some iterations of that course, as I've been teaching it, have been called For Our Grandchildren and Theirs, meaning their grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren, navigating us versus them and other threats to democracy. Because the us versus them worldview is a very dangerous worldview, especially in its unhealthy iteration, and is currently being used to dismantle the democratic structures of the United States. So let's go back historically for a bit. Let me get a sip of water before I do that. Evidence of the underlying collective shadow of the United States can be found in the foundational subjugations of this country. There were three foundational subjugations: that of women, that of Africans and then African Americans, and that of the indigenous peoples of the North American continent. Each one of those histories, the history of women and their subjugation, the history of Africans and their enslavement and ongoing subjugation, and then the history of Native Americans, the American Indian, the indigenous peoples of this continent. Thousands of volumes have been written and continue to be written about that. So I'm not going to try to summarize any one of those three subjugations in this brief conversation that we're having, or monologue that I'm perpetrating upon you. But the ongoing subjugations include the people of Vietnam, the people of Iraq, the people of Iran, right? The post 9/11 wars that we've engaged in. Okay, they've always been us versus them, and often it was a them that had nothing to do with what anybody else did to us. All right. So again, men versus women. That's one. All right. Whites versus blacks, or Europeans versus Africans. Two. All right. Whites versus indigenous peoples, or Europeans and then Americans versus Native Americans. Um, Foundational subjugations grounded in ignorance and arrogance, often in fear, growing into bigotry, manifesting in violence, often motivated by greed and excess, manifesting in bullying, and perhaps the best example, although I don't want to start comparing and contrasting subjugations, but that the United States federal government betrayed, and state governments as well, broke every treaty they made with every Native American nation they made treaties with, is the perfect example of the untrustworthiness. So again, we're not making this stuff up. It's there in history. Nowadays, we subjugate selected immigrants depending on political necessity. Currently, as I say this in 2026, Muslim immigrants, Latino, Chicano immigrants, Spanish-speaking immigrants, especially not so much from Spain, but from the Caribbean, Central American, South American countries. Those are the targets currently being subjugated by the white, and some might argue white supremacist patriarchal power structures. That really hasn't changed. Has progress been made? Yes, absolutely. All right. For women, for African Americans, less so, I think, for Native Americans, um, but there's still a long way to go. So we need to look at the Constitution of the United States. There are arguments ongoing whether it's sacred scripture, as some people treat it, whether it's an 18th century relic, as other people insist, something in between, or something else entirely. I would argue that it's an 18th century relic, badly in need of amendment, revision, or a new constitutional convention, which isn't going to happen, this week or this month or this year, I know. But if you look at it closely, there are no rights for women in it, and that's an ongoing debate. We're not going to get into the attempts to pass an equal rights amendment, but that's there. Africans and then African Americans were considered, for tax and representation purposes in the South, 3/5 of a human being, and Native Americans weren't even considered persons. Okay. So that's problematic if it's actually going to be a democracy, going back to that idea of human dignity. It's filled with counter-majoritarian compromises. So the Senate is a disproportionate body. States like Connecticut or Wyoming or Montana, South Dakota, smaller states population-wise, have 2 senators. States like California, Texas, New York, and Florida have 2 senators. So a senator from a small state might, represent, I don't know how many million people. A senator from a larger state is going to represent way more millions of people. All right. So the people don't have the same proportion of representation in the Senate. Right? That was done for reasons, but it was a compromise to keep the small states happy back in the 18th century. The Electoral College is a similar problem because it removes the election of the president from the American people and puts it in the hands of a small band of electors in the given states. And because of the nature of the political world in the United States in the 21st century, only a handful of states are contestable because of the polarization. And basically a handful of states decides who's president. it's common sense, and I know there are legal arguments against what I'm about to say, but it's common sense that the one office that represents an elected official that's going to represent all American citizens, regardless of what state they're from, the presidency, that it shouldn't matter where the citizen is voting from. The vote is for the president of the United States. Whether I'm voting in Arizona, whether I'm voting in New York, Connecticut, Florida, Montana, doesn't matter. I'm voting for the president, right? A popular vote should vote for the president of the United States. The Electoral College is a counter-majoritarian system, right? It does not honor what the majority of the people want. Article 5 of the Constitution. The Constitution should not be simple to amend so that we amend it every month, but it should be challenging to amend. The founding fathers did not foresee political parties. They did not foresee the level of polarization in the 21st century. And Article 5, which requires 2/3 of the Senate and the House, and a ratification by 3/4 of the states, is impossible nowadays to amend the Constitution, which is badly in need of amendment. And part of that is because the two parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both care more about their own existence than about the good of the country. So that's evidence if you look at Congress. That's true of the people I vote for as well. Right? They're in Congress, and the Congress is not particularly functional. So Article 5 is a problem. And there's much more detail to this. I don't want to dive too deeply into it. We appoint judges to the federal courts for their lifetime, for as long as they want to stay. That has to change, right? Absolutely has to change. And then there's the myth of the nonpartisan judiciary, that in fact, judges are above partisanship. Just look around, pay attention to what's going on in the courts, both the Supreme Court and some of the circuit courts as well. The district courts as well, so circuit and district courts. So there is partisanship in the courts. Not in every court. There actually are some really good judges who really seem to apply the rule of law and are not caught in the partisanship, but there are some who are. Right? We need to speak about voting in this country. Who can vote, right? Which groups want all citizens to vote and who doesn't want all citizens to vote and why they don't, and what's the history of that. Briefly, beginning in the late 70s and 1980s, through the Heritage Foundation and other groups. In fact, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, co-founder, Paul Weyrich, said in a public event, 12,000 evangelical pastors and other political activists and political organizers in Dallas, Texas in 1980, he basically said out loud, I don't want everybody to vote. In fact, we do better when everybody doesn't vote. A majority of the people have never elected, public officials, and we don't want them to. You can find that quote online. You can read it. You can hear him say it. And there has been work, and this is mainly in response to, but not only in response to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There has been work to weaken that act since it was passed, really, but it really got traction in the 1980s and 1990s and forward. And in recent Supreme Court decisions, John Roberts, who was a strong opponent of the Voting Rights Act beginning in the 1980s, when he was an assistant to the Attorney General in the Reagan administration, he was opposing the Voting Rights Act back then. So he's now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and in two decisions, Shelby County versus Holder and Louisiana versus Calais, or was it Calais versus Louisiana? I forget. Both Section 5 and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act have been gutted, and states around the country, especially but not only southern states, who are dominated by white legislators, legislatures are gutting the congressional districts in their states and making them majority white. So it's basically a white supremacist move to remove the power of the black vote. Tennessee was the first one to do it, but other states have been falling in line. Again, I'm speaking, a week or two after the Calais decision was handed down. So there's a long, long history of those folks who want everyone to vote and those folks who don't want everyone to vote. And the folks who don't want everyone to vote are primarily white, wealthy, heterosexual. I don't want to, and probably male too, but there are some women who support this attempt to deny the vote to certain people as well. So voting is important, which brings us to a current situation. The relationship among the Christian right, who basically funded and chose Donald Trump when he got the Republican nomination, Project 2025, which is effectively a Christian right document, and Donald Trump himself, who, for the most part, was never particularly conservative, and who sent money, along with Melania, sent money to Kamala Harris's reelection for California Attorney General back in her, I think during her second run for Attorney General, they actually donated to her campaign for some reason or other. So the relationship between Trump, Project 2025, and its authors and the Christian right it's actually not that complex, but it's complicated. There's lots of weaving in and out of it. So suffice it to say this. Once Trump got the nomination in 2016, one of the men he defeated was Ben Carson. And Ben Carson is a conservative Christian, a brilliant pediatric neurosurgeon who is honored as a pediatric neurosurgeon and as a hero, not just in the African-American community, but especially there. But he also has worked really hard to do things from a political standpoint after he put his scalpel down to move on behalf of basically a white, wealthy white conservative majority. Trump asked Ben Carson for his endorsement, and Carson said he would only endorse him if Trump would speak to a specific evangelical pastor, a televangelist, who is very popular with the evangelical community nationwide. Trump agreed to do so more than once. This particular minister shared that he thought Donald Trump was a worthy person who was going to, evolve as a Christian, and that we should, we, the conservative Christian right, should put their support behind him. Right? You can go read the newspaper reports of this. You can hear the videos at the Watchers on the Wall meetings. So all of this is fully documented. Fast forward, Trump began to do two things: to manifest or execute the desires of the Christian right, and to continue to build his own empire as a real estate developer and alleged billionaire. In the second term, if you take a look at the writings in Project 2025, and you look at as I'm speaking now, approaching 300 executive orders from this president in his second term. There were 225 in 2025, and I forget how many there are now. Much of the language in some of the executive orders comes directly from Project 2025. So it's not Trump's agenda. Probably he doesn't understand half of what he's executing. But it's the agenda of a small group of mostly men, mostly white, mostly Christian, mostly heterosexual men who want America to be a certain way. That's Project 2025. So much damage has been done from 2017 forward. it doesn't affect everyone equally and at the same time. So right now, as I'm saying this, some people are upset because gas prices are way up over $4, some places over $5, some places over $6 a gallon. So there are many things that the Trump administration has done through tariffs and through the war in Iran and through, you know, leaving our allies in NATO and Europe, many things, too many for this particular conversation. But a lot of people are hurt much worse than other people. For the most part, other than prices and the angst I feel, what he's doing to the country right now does not directly affect my day-to-day life. But I understand it well enough to know that it will definitely affect the lives of, I don't have grandchildren, I'll say yet, being hopeful, but the lives of the children and grandchildren of people that I know and care for deeply. It's a different America. So much of what's going on, and it's a war of words, it's a war of language, it's an us versus them. I'm going to say a few words to you now. I'm getting near the end of this. So over the last, 10 years really, but especially in the last year and a half or 2 years, let's say since 2020, prior to 2020, virtually nobody in America ever heard of critical race theory or intersectionality. Think about that. You've probably heard the word woke now. You've probably heard of critical race theory and intersectionality and DEI initiatives. Think about when you first became aware of that language and what you heard about it. It was sometime after 2020, during 2020 or after. I don't have time to tell you the whole story of that. You can, again, find out why. And basically what the Trump administration did, with the support of the Christian right, was they demonized some language. So woke became a bad word. And in fact, some people who were allegedly woke on the left helped them do this. That's a whole other story. Critical race theory became this monster, which it's not. Diversity, equity, and inclusion became a monster, which is not. And intersectionality became something to be against, even though the majority of the people that I've spoken to in person who oppose it, this is true of critical race theory as well, if when asked what it is, can't tell you. They just know, excuse me, they're supposed to be against it. So that's worth diving more deeply into, and I do that in the class that's coming up and beginning on May 31st, a 10-week class, but I'm not trying to market that right now. I'll mention it, but I'm just sharing this information for educational purposes to provide a really brief 10-year overview of what's been going on. And then another word which has been not in the last decade only, but for decades now, and probably for a century, is the S word, the S words, socialism or socialized. And especially when it comes to healthcare or any issue or any law or any movement that attempts to help people who need help, poor people who need help. So the attempt to provide universal health care to American citizens. In other words, to bring America up into the category of the rest of the post-industrialized nations around the world, throughout Europe, Canada, even in communist nations where they have socialized healthcare. But in America, it's for profit, and there's too much money at stake to provide it to everyone because the people who make the money don't want the system to change. But here's the problem with calling it socialized medicine. there are many aspects of American life that are socialized. Right now, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, wants $1.5 trillion for 1 year budget for the military. All right, the military is a socialized program. If we get attacked, I'm 71 years old now, I don't have to get my rifle out and go fight somewhere, right? The military does that. So we all put money into a pool and we have this socialized military, right? I've never paved an interstate highway, but my tax dollars have provided for roads that go across state lines. I've never paved a local road myself, but my tax dollars pay for that too. So we have socialized roadways. Locally, when there's a fire in my neighborhood, there haven't been anything recently, there's a socialized fire department. When there's a crime committed, there's a socialized police department. All of these things, according to the word socialized, are in fact socialized. And there are other examples as well. Social Security, obviously. Why any human being would be against that is beyond me. But socialized is a boogeyman word for many Americans. However, when it comes to Harley Davidson, General Motors, Ford, the entire airline industry, the banking industry, every major bank that you can name, whether it's Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, I'm not going to try to name all of them. Every one of these multi-billion-dollar corporations have been bailed out by my tax dollars, not just mine, obviously. So the argument is that these large companies are too big to fail. And the counter, and that's said out loud, because if they fail, bad things will happen. The counter argument, which nobody says out loud, is that an individual American citizen who needs help is too small to help. I mean, the second leading cause of bankruptcy in America in 2021 is due to medical costs. People go bankrupt because they can't afford to pay their medical bills, right? And that's not all. Prior to 2016, and this will be true post 2028, regardless of who's president, if Donald Trump gets a third term, if another Republican gets elected, if a Democrat gets elected. So prior to 2016, post 2028, there were many issues on the table that the United States needed to address, still need to address, will need to address. And some of them are global issues, not just American issues. Among them, planetary ambivalence, global warming, climate change. Not a myth, not a hoax. Sorry. If you think it is, I don't know what to say to you. Healthcare. Right? A lack of health and caring in this country. A culture of violence. We kill about 100 of ourselves every day just with guns. A culture of anxiety, depression, and suicide. Unprecedented. Disproportionately among our young people, and among them, disproportionately among our young women. The flaw that I mentioned at the top of this conversation, that money, things, and beliefs are more important than people, that underlies all of this. But these are issues that needed to be addressed regardless of who got elected president in 2016 and in 2024, that have been ignored and or exacerbated during the Trump presidency, and that are getting worse as we speak. All right. So even if, let's just say for a second, I'm going to speak, but I'm not a member of either of the political parties. I'm an independent voter. I'm an unaffiliated voter. But let's assume that you're a Democrat who's against Trump. Even if you're the best candidate you can imagine gets elected in 2028, and imagine that the Democrats get the House and the Senate in 2026. Let's imagine that. Okay. What the country faces post 2026, post 2028 is immense. It's enormous. Right? I haven't mentioned artificial intelligence yet and the dangers inherent therein. I haven't mentioned just the problems we have with social media, which lead to a lot of the problems that our young people are having. I haven't mentioned the distractions that even adults have with their phones and social media. I haven't mentioned the wealth disparity, the income and wealth disparity that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. A handful of men own more wealth, right, than the bottom 50% of Americans. And that number is probably even worse now. That's a conservative estimate. These are really difficult and dangerous issues. They're not going to go away overnight, and they're not going to be resolved by billionaires. That sounds like a cliche, I know, but if you look at what the majority of the billionaires are doing, from changing the media landscape and more specifically depleting the number of real journalists that are available in what used to be journalistic institutions, allowing for the attacks on education in this country at all levels, it just gets worse and worse. So well, I'll end this now in about 5 minutes. Where this leads us to, and where this has to come down, is on our shoulders. Right? All of us are complicit in this mess. We're not all equally complicit. We have different levels of complicity. But we're called to, I'm going to use the S word, a different S word now, take a spiritual perspective, a sense of true identity. What's your ultimate identity? Right? What's your ultimate purpose in life? Not your job, right? Not your job description, but your purpose in life. Who are you really? How do you choose to be? How would it impact you if it were true that everything is a story? And if your gut reaction is that's not true, my gut reaction is, well, that's your story. Right? When was the last time you asked yourself, what am I missing? That's shadow work. What am I not seeing? Right? Ask yourself, who are your people? That's actually a sneaky developmental question. Are your people just you? Are your people certain groups? Are your people all humans? Are your people, people all that is? How aware are you of your impact on the world and those closest to you? And how aware are you of what impacts you? Finally, how are you in relationship with all these questions, with all of this history and psychology and this little, dab of spirituality? And does it matter? Have you reflected on the fact that you're going to die? All right, so I'll just go through those one more time. Reflect. Who am I? How do I choose to be? Everything is a story. What am I missing? Who are my people? What's my impact? What impacts me? I'm going to die. And how am I in relationship with all of this? From the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act to the billionaires taking over to another preemptive war in Iran to the murders being committed of men in boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific with no proof of who they are. We don't know their names. We don't know what they were doing. We have to trust that they were shipping drugs in speedboats and that we didn't chase them, arrest them, and execute the rule of law, we just kill them. How am I in relationship with all of that? So thank you for listening to this. Again, this is the evolution of this book, which came out in 2022, which is now the historical parts of it are still up to date. The spiritual aspects of it are still up to date. Psychological stuff's up to date, but the current events part of it is somewhat dated. It ended in 2022. We'll be diving into a version of this evolution of this material from May 31st to August 9th, 2026. On Sunday afternoons, 1 to 3 p.m. You can find out more on the website, healingamericasnarratives.com, and you just click on courses, and you can find out more about that there. Thank you for listening. I know this was a little bit on the long side, but there are two groups of people that I interact with. Some like to get little blips, 4 or 5 minutes at a time, and others want to get the fuller picture. This is not the course. This is just the bullet points that are covered in the course, but it's a slightly more detailed version than anything I've offered previously. So again, thank you for hanging in there, if in fact you have hung in there. Again, this is Reggie Mara speaking about healing America's narratives, speaking about what we need to do for our grandchildren and theirs, speaking about the dangers of this ongoing, deeply rooted us versus them developmental worldview that is responsible for all human atrocities at scale and what we might be able to do about it. So again, thank you for listening. This is May 14th, 2026.